Hello, thank you all very much, and thank you for joining us at the Speculative Economics session. I am a science fiction writer, although my books did not actually have spaceships until a friend of mine from NASA asked me what happened to the space program in my future, and then I had to put them in the sequel. But my books are set about 60 years in the future, and they're largely about a sort of sociological technology and how that changes, but I'll get to that more in a minute. Today I really want to talk about stories. I am someone who thinks a lot in stories, and I use stories a lot in all my different work, from humanitarian work to academic work, and obviously in the stories that I tell with my novels. So we're going to talk about how you can use stories to think both in very radical ways and in very productive ways about the future, and use that to work back to how we can take different approaches to changing the present. And to do this, I'm going to draw from some science fiction greats. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. This is William Gibson, who, if you're not familiar, invented the term cyberspace. And I think this is an idea that those of us who travel and who live in a lot of different places and who move around the world can really understand it and are familiar with this concept, that as you move around the world, you are almost in different places in time. You go somewhere and it's like being in the future. All of a sudden there are high-speed trains. All of a sudden there are apps that work better. All of a sudden you have internet connectivity through an entire city. All of a sudden you're seeing architecture that looks like what you think of as the future. And this raises a question for me, as someone who's also worked in development and someone who's studied economics. When we say the future is here but not evenly distributed, are we saying that resources are not evenly distributed? Are we basically equating the future with access to control of resources? So I'm going to leave that there to think about as part of why we thought it was useful to put together economics and science fiction. But I'm going to go back to our experience in moving around the world and seeing this future in different places. Because if you think about it also, you may notice that you're not just seeing the future differently distributed, but you're seeing different futures. So, for example, the last time I was in Japan, there were marvelous high-speed trains that were so much faster than the ones I can ride on in the States. But on the other hand, I would go to a hotel, and to use internet, I'd be handed a LAN cable because they were just not so into Wi-Fi. And so we see that the future is actually relative. That different places, as we move towards a global and collective future, different places are taking different paths to get there. They're finding different ways of using the resources that they have and sometimes reacting to the lack of resources. The ways that people construct their future are culturally specific. And so we can see a lot of different types of future. We can see then that the future is not already determined. We can see that technology does not move unidirectionally, and it is not an inevitable path that takes us directly through land to Wi-Fi and at the same time high-speed trains. Things move in a different order in different places. Certain technologies are rejected in different places. And also because this was something that I think is in all of our minds, particularly after the opening keynote today. Sometimes what we think of the future is not necessarily where we're going to get to. If we consider the threats of climate change, if we consider the impacts of technological disasters, sometimes it's the places that we think of as traveling to the past that may be most representative of our future. So I want to keep that in mind as well. And to move to another science fiction great, Ursula Le Guin, who if you haven't read, please do. Start with The Dispossessed, or The Left Hand of Darkness, or really anything. Anyway, she's fabulous. And she said in a keynote speech at the National Book Awards, "We live in capitalism, its power seems inescapable, but then so did the divine right of kings." This is a quote that reminds us that our ideas about the possibilities are very much culturally determined. And by cultural, I'm not just talking about place, I'm talking very much about time. The world we live in now seems inevitable to us and it seems inescapable. And yet when we look in the past, that was the case then too. And this is a quote also that, especially if you're familiar with the author and the way she worked, implicit in this is the power of stories. Because why do we believe that capitalism is inescapable? It's not just because it's what we know and what we're familiar with and what surrounds us, like water surrounds a fish. It's also because we're constantly being told in a million different ways that that is the case, that this is the economic system that works, and that all we have to do is be really, really good at it. We're getting that not only in very explicit ways, whether it's through economic textbooks or articles that explain why communism failed, but we're also getting it in all these implicit ways, which are often much more dangerous. We are getting told all the time through tourism advertisements that are about shopping, and through feature stories about how you can make more money for the holidays, and stories about the rich people and the cribs that they live in. We're being told that this is the way the world functions. But this quote also reminds us that even though we have these stories that can really reinforce the status quo and that can continue to trap us in our cultural mindset, it's also possible to tell stories that help us break out of that. The same way that Utopia, which got a brief mention earlier, helped to break out of this idea of the divine right of kings as the only sensible form of government. And for me, the framework that I use to think about the ways that stories can both be reinforcing and can be very radical is narrative disorder. This is a syndrome that I invented and then made both common and accepted in the future of my books, which is one of the uses of writing science fiction. And it's a disorder that almost everyone suffers from to one degree or another. And it has two main symptoms. The first one is narrative addiction. And I think most of us are quite familiar with this. If you have ever binged a Netflix show, if you have a large number of holds at your library that you are waiting to come to you, if you can't leave a bookstore without buying a book, you might have some form of narrative disorder, and particularly addiction. I certainly suffer from it very badly. So we are addicted to narrative, and this shows not only in those sort of accepted media that we think about as the way that we choose to ingest narrative, but it shows also in the way narrative permeates our culture. So we see narrative in news features that follow an arc. We see narrative even in short news stories that still try to find a kind of balance that really has less to do with journalistic integrity than an idea that we have from stories that there must be some kind of nuance to the bad guys and the good guys. We see this, that we are so accustomed to it, that advertisements that are 30 seconds long, that are 15 seconds long, that are 5 seconds long before that YouTube video, only have to hit certain beats and certain tropes for our brains to put together the rest of the narrative into a coherent story. We are very accustomed to certain forms of narrative and to putting those together, to filling in the gaps, because we already know what a narrative is supposed to look like and supposed to feel like. And that brings us to the second symptom, which is narrative perception. As we ingest narratives all the time, and as we, in our different cultures, ingest the same types of narrative, the same tropes and the same approaches and the same rhythms over and over again, we start to feel like that is the way life works. And we start to see things that we experience as if they're a story. And this can be useful sometimes, because since a lot of us are suffering from this, since a lot of us are feeling this way, and some people act like they're in a story. And so sometimes that gives you a kind of intuition as to what's going to happen. That's how it works out for some of the characters in my books who have this disorder and are a little bit stigmatized by it, but also find it a really useful intuition. But it has this twin effect that we saw from the previous slide. On the one hand, it can trap us in tropes. It can make us believe that the things we read in stories are the normal way that life functions, when in fact, as we know, stories change over time. The idea of what made a good story, what made a story satisfying, what made a narrative useful and coming to a good conclusion is very different now than it was 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago on the other side of the world. The ideas about the kinds of stories that we can tell have changed whether it's a heroic epic or a long drawn out novel of manners or a rom-com. These things have evolved. But as we're stuck in our own culture and our own ideas, we tend to focus on that type of narrative. We tend to focus on the things that those narratives tell us are important. But there's a benefit to this too. There's a danger of getting caught in tropes, but there's also a benefit in that this familiarity with narrative, it tells us something about the way people interact in our world. It tells us something about the values. It tells us something about relationships. And that sense for what makes a good story today and here and now can be really helpful in adding a kind of rigor to the experiments that we conduct, the thought experiments that we conduct in our heads about looking into the future. Because if we're going to tell something radical, if we're going to imagine something different, for people to believe it, it's very easy to get people to believe in generation ships that travel the solar system to look for a different planet to colonize. It's very easy to get people to believe in flying machines and jetpacks, which already exist, but only in some places because it's unevenly distributed. You can even get people to believe in dragons. The trick is having those relationships, the relationships between people, the relationships between groups, the relationship between whatever that element of difference is, and the society that's broadly the same as what people are used to. If you get those relationships right, if you think about the way it functions so that people read it and they say, yeah, this makes sense as a story to me, that's where people can begin to buy that things can be different. They can begin to believe that, yes, if we had a generation ship, this is probably how people would interact on it. This is probably the way the resources would have gone into building it, and that would have created certain social hierarchies, and yeah, that makes sense as something that we could potentially do. This could happen. We can see it. So I've been talking about fictional narrative because although I've done a little economics, I prefer to read fiction. I'm sorry. We have other economists here to hold up the nonfiction side of things. But in fact, economics is also a narrative. Economics is also a narrative that has its own tropes, where economists build on what other economists have done. Things become trendy, and people continue to look into them. And you get certain ideas about methodologies as well as topics. Which topics are chosen, what people are interested in studies, these become tropes. And economic papers, economic theory, these also become narratives about the kinds of things we expect to happen. This is, of course, more of a social science quote, but I think it's quite applicable to economics as well. And it's a good reminder that it's not only novelists and TV writers who are coming up with these fictions. It's also the state. It's also any institutions that work with data, because we always need to be taking that data and drawing extrapolations from it, and that's always going to be a process of creating fictions. And sometimes, if there's enough power in whatever institution is doing it, it means also influencing the real world to make those fictions as real as possible. But my colleague is going to talk more and more specifically about this, but I could not resist mentioning the ways in which economics itself is also speculative fiction. Theoretical economics, just like any other type of theory, is something that imagines a model of the way the world is. And it's always going to necessarily be different from the reality because it's somewhat simplified to make the model more clear. And it's interesting to me having these ideas about narrative and the way that we can test our narrative through our own narrative disorder, through our own instincts about what makes sense and what doesn't. That economics recently has taken a turn to saying that we can't just build these models with stick figures of perfectly rational actors, because that doesn't make sense to us. That story does not work because people don't work that way. And so there's this movement now towards looking at the behavior of those actors and looking at people that are not perfectly rational as we try to think through our economic models. But beyond the theory, also, even in economic practice, we see a lot of speculation. We see the obvious link there that people speculate in economics. They imagine a kind of future and use that imagination to make money that is itself often pretty much imaginary, at least until a certain point when it becomes real. And a lot of the economic practice that goes on is based on evidence that is much scarcer. So if we talk particularly about macroeconomics, we have a very small evidence base to work with. And yet this is presented by governments as a kind of knowledge that can be used to drive the future and to determine what future we get to. So economics is also a very speculative arena. And for me particularly, as someone who's worked in development, I think that development is an area, an application of economics that is both particularly speculative and particularly flexible and interesting in terms of using narrative. When we practice development, we are explicitly saying that we're working towards a kind of future. We're trying to change what exists and build it into something different. And we use techniques, we use a toolbox to do that that includes things like theoretical economics. And that also includes narrative, because a lot of times what we do to change behavior or to change the practices or to shift the economic actions of a place, we talk about aspirational behaviors and we create stories around the ways that we want people to act. But I think the point that we really need to look at critically in that is to question what future we're building towards. Is it the future that we are being told is inescapable? And the model of a good, a wealthy, a properly functioning economy that we are being told constantly is the right way to go and the way that all the best countries are doing it and the way that we want. Is that something that, is it an ideal that we've developed in a participatory way? Who is deciding that? Are there other options that we haven't considered? Are there ways that we can think about development moving towards a different kind of goal? And that's something that we can't just ask one time in this session, but that we have to be asking continuously, because the future, and I say this as someone who writes about it, is a moving target. I realized as I looked over this presentation too, that while I've talked a lot about the importance and the power of writing speculative fiction and of creating future narratives, I didn't talk much about how to do it. So I'm going to give you just a few very brief tips before we move on to continue talking about economics and why it is a speculative field. And these also speak to why I think that development is a particularly fertile area for this, in the sense that I particularly, when I build my futures, I like to work off of frustration. I like to work off of challenges and things that don't make sense to me in terms of why we do them. And I think we find a lot of those in the development arena. From there, it's important to be able to think of something wild and crazy that will take care of those frustrations and those challenges. To imagine something that's completely not possible right now, probably. Although you never know. I mean, we heard earlier about a house that's powered entirely by lichen, so I'm not going to say what's actually possible now everywhere. The future is unevenly distributed. But imagine something as wild as you can to fix that problem. Because sometimes it takes a radical, impossible idea to help you to see what the assumptions are right now that are tying you down to inefficiencies, that are tying you down to inequalities, and that are tying you down to oppression. And once you have that idea, usually, if you want to create a narrative that is coherent, that functions well, that gives you that sense of satisfaction, that none of these economists can poke holes into and say, but where's your supply chain? Usually it requires a lot of thinking and a lot of iteration to write the stories, to see how your characters work, to imagine if fiction is not your bag, to imagine it as an economic model playing out over and over again, with some other perspectives until you've found those holes and plugged them up. And then you're going to have a very satisfying story that tells you maybe something about the future, possibly, but much more importantly, tells you something about the present that you're dealing with every day. Thank you very much.